When you're making a film, one of the most critical, one of the most important things is getting it funded. So how do you go about getting your funding?
Half of the work goes into getting films funded, that's the thing. So you need to be ready for this, and you need to be ready for the big questions that your potential investors, funders, donors, whatever you want to call them, are going to ask you. And we're going to cover that off today. There are three main areas that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so the first question we pretty much always get asked is, who's your target demographic?
So we're going to be covering that. We're also going to be talking about how you answer the question, what's your timeline?
And then the third thing is, who's going to see it and how do you measure the impact?
All right, so let's get into it.
All right, so first things first, audience demographic. This is a question that always comes up. Your potential investor is always going to say, who's your film for? Who are you making this project for?
And the way you want to answer this question is to be specific. Don't be broad. You want to get really specific here, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely, because the worst possible answer you can give is, this is such an important project, it is for a broad general audience, because any funder is going to immediately go, okay, you don't know who you're talking to.
So I think a better answer to that question is to say something like, for example, our film targets women aged 35 to 55, but we know that there's going to be audience spill into these areas.
And the reason that you need to be that specific is because in order to speak to an audience, you really have to understand and know who that audience is. And you can't do that if you think you're just talking to a big, broad audience, because people have very different interests, and depending on the topic of your film, is going to suit very different people.
It's actually not that hard to get to your answer, because if you make a proof of concept film, and we often do start with a proof of concept as filmmakers, release it on a platform like YouTube, and YouTube will tell you, as you drill down in the analytics, if there's a gender skew and if there's an age range sweet spot, and that's what you want to be talking to your funders about first. And then you know that your audience is going to be broader than that, and that's okay. Then you talk about where the audience may also be located outside of that demographic.
Yeah, and that's when you're getting into your audience segments. But before you even get to that, it really is about the research. It's about how you research who that audience is. And we come from a values-based approach, and we actually teach you all about that in our online course called Define Your Ideal Audience, where we really show you all the different techniques we use to really drill down and understand who our audiences are before we even start creating our projects. And it's just so important to do it.
Okay, so big guy, if we want to get access to that course, Define Your Ideal Audience, where would you find it?
moonshinecommunicationsacademy.com.
Yeah, that's right. So just head over there and you can check that one out. But as Mike was saying, you need to be quite clear on who you're speaking to, and you need to figure out probably who that niche audience is, and then who the audience segment that will ripple out from that.
Yep, and then the next big question that you're likely to get asked is, what's the timeline? And you may not know what the answer to that is, and that's okay.
But you just have to be a bit realistic. So you sort of think about it realistically, you know, how long's your production phase? Do you think you can film, once you're funded, do you think you can film everything in 6 weeks, or is it 6 months? And then your post-production, typically post-production, for a documentary, you're not going to get out of that for less than 4 months. So probably a year. I mean, could be 2 years. Really depends what you're doing.
And the good news is that I don't think most funders that we talk to, at least, want an answer that is like really soon. You know, they actually need a bit more time to fund into this, prepare for it, make sure it aligns with their own activities, and can really maximize the effort that they're going to be putting in as well. So having a more realistic, longer time frame probably works in your favor. And often if you don't have a fixed timeline, it's really good to talk about how you're going to consult with all of the project partners to pick the best time window to release this film. And that's really true, isn't it? So, yeah, you actually do want to find that sweet spot in time where you're going to be able to make the most impact.
Yeah, if there's a topical day and date that your theme of your film ties into, that's probably going to come around once a year, and you want to time your release to be around that so that it's already sort of in the public thinking, and so your film kind of ties in with all of that, and the publicity can tie in with all of that.
Yeah, so be specific but be broad. I would be picking a timeline that's realistic, say, 18 to 24 months in the future, but then also saying there's some built-in flexibility here based on how we make the maximum impact from this film, and always allow yourself some buffer for production and post-production.
And you'll know if you ever are applying for any kind of film funding from screen agencies or from investment funds or whatever it is, they're always like 6 to 12 week turnaround before you get an answer about it. So that they're not expecting anything to happen really quickly.
Yeah, that's right. So the last big question that you might get asked is, how does this film get seen, and how are you going to measure the impact of it?
And that's where you really need to be thinking about your distribution. So in the last episode, we actually talked a lot about how we distribute our impact films, because we usually start from a campaign at least a year out from the release date.
Yeah, and I find what's really helpful here is to list out every potential platform where this film's going to be seen, including even where it's going to get publicised, and then putting a number to that, a realistic number about how far that's going to reach, and then, you know, putting them all down into a list. And then you can start getting a sense of what's your target reach you're going for here. That's something that you can then measure, evaluate, and report back to your funders down the track.
So there you have it. There's 3 questions that we are always asked when we are trying to fundraise for our films. The first one is, who's your target demographic? Who is your audience? The second one is,
what's the timeline?
And thirdly, it's around how's it going to get seen and how you're going to measure the impact of your film. So if you can nail the answers to those 3 questions, you are a long way down the road to really convincing an investor that you know exactly what your film is for and why it needs to be produced.
Yep, and if you want to check out Define Your Ideal Audience online course, follow the links in the show notes, and we'll see you next week.